Okay, hey guys. Today we're going to be talking about the Crito by Plato. Some background info. The Crito takes place after Socrates was indicted and found guilty by a democratic jury and sentenced to death for impiety, which is basically like he didn't believe in the proper gods they said he was supposed to, and for corrupting the minds of the youth. They said he basically went around playing these rhetorical word games, tricking people into thinking that the worse argument was the better one, and blah, blah, blah. He was doing all this bad stuff. So he was indicted. His trial is told in a dialogue called The Apology. And spoiler alert, at the end of that dialogue, not only is he found guilty, but he's sentenced to death for literally just going around town asking questions. Because, again, people didn't like that he kind of made the public realize that all these powerful people didn't know as much as they thought they knew. And the other thing to note is that this dialogue further complicates the discussion of justice that we already started in the beginning of the semester when we talked about the Republic. Because remember, we had these questions like, what is justice? Is it telling the truth and paying debt? Is it hurting some people and hurting some people and benefiting some people? Is it the stronger overcoming the weaker, things like that? So that was already tough, right? Is it intrinsically good? Is it consequentially good? But now we're taking all these other concepts into account, like law and authority and obedience. So we're looking at the government. And this is why this second half of the class is called Applied Social Political Ethics. Because in the first half, we were just talking about these ethical theories kind of in the abstract, right? Like, what are the general principles of being good and of being bad? But in this second half, we're situating those principles within a governmental and social context, where we're looking at different types of government structures and maybe different laws and different suggestions for policy and determining whether or not these things are ethical. So some stuff to keep in mind. So here's the opening question. Do you guys think that it's ever okay to break a law? There's a bunch of different ways we can think about this. You can think about something as small as, is it ever okay to not wear your seatbelt? Or is it okay to use certain substances? Or is it okay to steal something little? Or you could think on a bigger scale, like, is it okay to steal lots of stuff? Is it okay to harm certain people sometimes? Is it okay to resist arrest? So these are all the questions you want to keep in the back of your mind, because the reasoning that happens within this dialogue is going to ground our answers or the way we engage with this question. So let's check it out. Remember, in this dialogue, it's already known that Socrates was sentenced to death. And by the way, his method of death, I guess you could say, was supposed to be drinking this poison that they called hemlock. So Socrates is in his jail cell. His friend Crito bribes the guard and is trying to bust him out. And so they have this argument about whether or not he would escape. And Crito starts off by saying, if you die, it will not be a single misfortune for me. Not only will I be deprived of a friend, the like of whom I shall never find again, but many people who do not know you or me very well will think that I could have saved you if I were willing to spend money, but that I did not care to do so. Surely there can be no worse reputation than to be thought to value money more highly than one's friends. For the majority will not believe that you yourself were not willing to leave prison, while we were eager for you to do so. And Socrates says, my good Crito, why should we care so much for what the majority think? The most reasonable people, to whom one should pay attention, or more attention, will believe that things were done as they were done. So let's hone in here. There's a couple things that Crito finds wrong with Socrates not wanting to escape. Right? The first thing is, I'm going to lose a friend. Right? Very simple. You're going to die. I don't think you should die. That's bad. But also he brings up this secondary issue, which is that if you don't escape, people are going to think that I didn't want to help you, So people are going to think I'm a bad person, and I'm going to get this bad reputation. So it's this twofold problem. But Socrates is pushing back. He's like, listen, it doesn't even matter if most people think that about you. Like, okay, maybe you get that reputation, but why should you care what they think? Because reputation isn't as important as actuality, right? People's beliefs aren't as important as the truth, and you'll know that you tried your best. So don't worry about it, right? We shouldn't care about what the majority of people think. But Crito has a pretty good response, right? He says, you see, Socrates, that one must also pay attention to the opinion of the majority, because your present situation makes clear that the majority can inflict not the least, but pretty well the greatest evils if slandered among them. So he's like, okay, I think you're being a little blind here. Like, obviously it matters what people think. Look at you. You're sentenced to death merely because of what people think. So we shouldn't ignore these things. And this raises an interesting question, right? We're talking about majority opinion. Ultimately, what we're talking about is democracy. So here's what I want you guys to think about. Is democracy a good thing? Right? We have this idea of democracy, which is that everyone gets a say in what happens policy-wise to society. And certainly in the Western world, we've kind of just assumed that this is a good thing. And that may be true, but it may not be true. So think about what happened. It's like the reasoning in favor of democracy would seem to be something like this. You have some issue that's going to affect people. Shouldn't people have the right to determine whether they want those policies implemented? All right, so the idea is that maybe it's not a good idea to have decisions made by a central authority, like a dictator or a king or an oligarchy or something like that. And maybe instead what should happen is that people should decide. Maybe this power should be decentralized so that everyone has an equal say and we get to vote. And maybe that's the case. And keep in mind, what we have in the States isn't even a pure democracy. It's a representative democracy. So we vote for people. Maybe there's problems with that. But maybe there's problems with democracy as a whole. And so I think right now I want you guys to kind of challenge your preconceived notions about democracy. Like think of what could be good, right? Think about the ways in which it's better than the alternatives. But also we have to shake our certainty. We have to start questioning whether like, oh, do those good things outweigh the bad things? What can go wrong? And these are some questions that we're going to be thinking about as we do the next few texts in the unit. But let's continue right now. Socrates, or rather Crito says, besides Socrates, I do not think that what you are doing is just, to give up your life when you can save it, and to hasten your fate as your enemies would hasten it, and indeed have hastened it in their wish to destroy you. Moreover, I think you are betraying your sons by going away and leaving them, when you could bring them up and educate them. You thus show no concern for what their fate may be. They will probably have the usual fate of orphans. Either one should not have children, or one should share with them to the end the toil of upbringing and education. You seem to me to choose the easiest path, whereas one should choose the path that a good and courageous man would choose, particularly when one claims throughout one's life to care for virtue. Okay, so you can look at this passage as a summation of Crito's argument for why Socrates should escape. And he gives like 4 reasons here, right? The first thing is that you shouldn't give up your life when you could save it. And in fact, it's immoral to do so. Not just you shouldn't do it, but that morally you shouldn't do it. Because throughout the text, we get the idea that it's not just about preserving your life. It's about preserving your life in the face of what you could say a wrongful sentence, right? So the idea is that Socrates was wrongfully sentenced to death. So it would, in fact, be immoral for him to give up his life in response to that sentence when it was wrong. Second reason, he's basically just giving in to the hands of his enemies. Like, they want to kill this guy. because he's speaking truth to power or whatever you want to call it. And they're going to kill him, and he shouldn't play into their hands. Thirdly, by dying, by being killed by the state, Socrates is betraying his sons, right? He has some children, and the idea is that when he leaves his children behind, they're not going to have the proper moral upbringing, and they're going to grow up fatherless. And surely it's not a good idea to do that if you have children, right? If you have kids, you should agree that you're going to help them as much as you can and not just give up your life. And kind of a funny joke that people always bring up here, they're like, isn't Socrates like 70? So how old are his children? Anyway, the argument still stands. And then lastly, this is an interesting one. Crito says that by choosing to be killed at the hands of the state, Socrates is choosing the easy path, not the virtuous path. And that's bad, period, like for anyone. But it's especially bad for Socrates, who claims to care about virtue, who claims that we should live the good life. So don't choose the easy thing, choose the right thing, is what Crito is saying. But of course, Socrates doesn't agree. And we're going to go through his argument, and his argument's going to wind up being very systematic. I know it's hard sometimes to go through these dialogues and to parse out like structurally specific arguments that exist, but it's really possible if you go line by line and do it slowly. I recommend doing that, and then also at the end trying to put all the pieces together, and that's what we're going to do here. So Socrates says, do we say that one must never in any way do wrong willingly, or must one do wrong in one way and not in another? Is to do wrong never good or admirable, as we have agreed in the past, or have all these former agreements been washed out during the last few days? Have we at our age failed to notice that for some time that in our serious discussions we were no different from children? Above all, is the truth such as we used to say it was, whether the majority agree or not, and whether we must still suffer worse things than we do now, or will be treated more gently, that nonetheless wrongdoing or injustice is in every way harmful and shameful to the wrongdoer? Do we say so or not? And Crito says, yeah, we do. So one must never do wrong. Certainly not. Nor must one, when wronged, inflict wrong in return, as the majority believe, since one must never do wrong. Okay, so the idea is that Socrates, he's kind of going to use Crito's reasoning against him, because remember, Crito says, you're not doing the virtuous thing. And Socrates is going to flip this on his head and say, no. I know it doesn't seem like I'm doing the right thing, but it actually is. And he's appealing to consistency and integrity right here. He's like, all right, so my whole life, I've been going around talking to people, and we've been thinking about these really serious matters and thinking how important justice is and thinking how important it is not to harm people. Because think back to Republic, Book 1. Remember, he says never to harm people. He's saying we have to stay consistent. Like, we don't just give up the things we agreed upon merely because I've been sentenced to death. Like, these things are still true, and the real test of virtue is not whether or not I'm going to do whatever it takes to survive, but the real test is whether I'm going to keep my principles, even if it means me dying, right? Because that's going to show that he really cares. Because at another line in the text, he says, listen, it's not about living life. Like, the goal shouldn't just be to preserve one's life. The goal should be to live a good life. And living a good life means really believing in the things that you say. And so this thing is that it's never good to harm someone, not just because it's bad for the person that gets harmed, but it's in some way shameful to the harmer, to the wrongdoer. And so one must never do wrong. And the key word there is never. That's not sometimes, that's never. And since you're never supposed to do wrong, this means that even when you were wronged first, you still don't do wrong, right? So it's not like you could be like, oh, but she did it to me. Like, that doesn't matter. You don't wrong someone even when you were wronged first, right? The fact that something bad happened to you does not now grant you permission to break the principles you proclaimed to hold on to. But we might want to ask here, like, okay, I get this reasoning about harm, but how does this relate to being in prison? How does this relate to escape? And this is exactly what we're going to talk about, because he has an interesting way of dealing with harm. On 53, Socrates says, well, then I state the next point, or rather I ask you, when one has come to an agreement that is just with someone, should one fulfill it or cheat on it? Crito says one should fulfill it. And Socrates responds by saying, well, see what follows from this. If we leave here without the city's permission, are we mistreating people whom we should least mistreat? Are we sticking to a just agreement or no? So the idea is that when you enter into an agreement with someone, you should uphold your end of the agreement, right? If you break your promise, if you agree to something and then kind of like fizzle out and renege on your promise, that's not good. Not only is it not good, he's going to say it's a form of harm because you're mistreating the people who you entered into the agreement with. And if you're wondering, like, okay, but who did he make an agreement with? The answer to this question is like Athens, right? The Athenian state, the people of Athens. And so he says, if we leave here, if we break out of prison illegally, we are mistreating those people who we have an obligation to. So let's recap, right? The idea is that for Socrates, one must never harm, even if one was harmed first. And breaking an agreement is akin to harm. But maybe this still doesn't make sense. Maybe you're still like, how does that count as harm? Like, you're breaking out of prison. You're not hurting someone. You're not like killing a state representative. It's not like you're harming someone who is part of the jury that convicted him. He's just leaving and presumably going to a different town. And Socrates has a really important argument for why this counts as harm, and it has to do with the laws. And it's ultimately going to point to this thing that we talked about when we talked about Book 2 of the Republic that we called the social contract. All right, so keep that in mind. That's one of those key terms. He says, look at it this way. If, as we are planning to run away from here, or whatever one should call it, the laws and the state came and confronted us and asked, tell me, Socrates, what are you intending to do? Do you not, by this action you are attempting, intend to destroy us, the laws, and indeed the whole city as far as you are concerned? Or do you think it's possible for a city not to be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts have no force but are nullified and set naught by private individuals? What shall we answer to this and other such arguments? So Socrates is kind of playing the devil's advocate to Crito. He's like embodying the laws, saying, okay, here's what the state, here's what the laws are going to ask you. And they're making a good point, and we're going to have to take it seriously. So the idea is that by breaking laws, are you not just attempting to destroy the city by doing that? And you may think, no, that's crazy. Like, I'm not intending to destroy the city by breaking laws. Like, they could still function if Socrates escapes. And even if you relate it to your own life, like, no, if I don't wear a seatbelt, that's not going to destroy the city. That's not what I'm trying to do. But there's a larger point here. It's like, okay, imagine if you just were able to pick and choose, right? To decide when and when not you want to follow laws. And imagine if everyone did that. Like, a city couldn't subsist. A government could not exist if the laws, if the verdicts of the courts weren't enforced. Or rather, if they were enforced, but you just did everything in your power to escape that enforcement. So, like, imagine if everyone all the time just kind of picked and chose when they wanted to follow the law. I mean, is there even law at that point? It seems like it would be a false state. It'd be like a simulacra of a state. And then he continues. This is where it gets even more interesting. He says, then what if the laws said, did we not first bring you to birth? And was it not through us that your father married your mother and begat you? Tell us, do you find anything to criticize in those of us who are concerned with marriage? And I would say that I do not criticize them. Or in those of us concerned with the nurture of babies and the education that you too received, were those assigned to that subject not right to instruct your father to educate you in the arts and in physical culture? And I would say that they were right. Very well, they would continue. And after you were born and nurtured and educated, could you in the first place deny that you are our offspring and servant, both you and your forefathers? If that is so, do you think that we are on equal footing as regards the right, and that whatever we do to you, it is right for you to do to us? You were not on equal footing with your fathers as regards the right, nor with your master, if you had one, so as to retaliate for anything they did to you, to revile them if they reviled you, to beat them if they beat you, and so with many other things. Do you think that you have this right to retaliation against your country and its laws? That if we undertake to destroy you and think it right to do so, you can undertake to destroy us as far as you can in return? And will you say that you are right to do so, you who truly care for virtue? Is your wisdom such as not to realize that your country is to be more honored than your mother, father, and all your ancestors, that it is more to be revered and more sacred, and that it counts for more among the gods and sensible men, that you must worship it, yield to it, and placate its anger more than your fathers? You must either persuade it or obey its orders, and endure in silence whatever it instructs you to endure, whether blows or bonds, and if it leads you into war to be wounded or killed, you must obey. What shall we say in reply, Crito? That the laws speak the truth or not? And Crito says, I think they do. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of powerful and potentially crazy language. Let's break it down line by line. So there's this multifaceted line of reasoning that Socrates, as the laws, takes. And this line of reasoning is supposed to justify his decision not to escape. So he says, okay, first of all, we birthed you, right? The state's services are literally responsible for birthing Socrates and allowing him to come into the world. So he accepted that benefit. Also, the state services married his parents. Thirdly, he was educated by the state. They gave him this service. And he's like, are you displeased with that? Should we have not married your parents and birthed you and gave you an education? The idea is that when you accept these services, you become indebted to the state. Socrates is an offspring. He's like the state's child. He's their servant. And they're really honing in on this master-slave language. He says, you're not on equal footing with your father. You're not on equal footing with your master. So you're not on equal footing with us. And they use this really, really strong language towards the middle. He says, your country is to be honored more than your mother, your father, and all your ancestors, right? Your country is more important. It's more to be revered. It's sacred, right? It literally counts for more among the gods. It has more worth. You must worship it. You must obey as a result of these things. So really powerful language. So if we were to break this down, the idea is that Socrates received a number of benefits from the Athenian state, right? And if you go in chronological order, the state married his parents, the state birthed him, and the state educated him. And upon accepting these benefits, Socrates agrees implicitly, right? Because he doesn't explicitly say, I am agreeing, which, by the way, is a distinction we'll talk about later on in the semester. He's agreeing implicitly to obey the state's laws. So the idea is, hey, we gave you all this stuff. The least you could do is follow the laws. Like, you have an obligation. We're not asking you to do much. The idea is you should agree to follow the laws, not just when you like them, but all the time, because we've done all this stuff for you. And we want to start to think about whether or not these are good arguments. And one idea you might have in mind is, I don't know. I don't know if some of these count as consent. Because that's the question, right? Is like, do any of these actions constitute something like consent? Because you need consent. in order for a contract, in order for an agreement to exist. So let's go down the list. You say, let's go in reverse order. You say, all right, they educated him. I don't know. He was small, right? Children can't consent. And then you go up and you say, birthed him. He was not even born yet. How can you choose to be born? Like, I didn't choose to do that. How can a baby in the midst of being born consent to something? And then you go back a step further and you're saying, wait. If babies can't consent, then how can people consent before they exist? The fact that the state married your parents, how does this count for anything? Like, this has nothing to do with you. And maybe that's true. But then they throw something else into the mix. They say, even so, by giving every Athenian the opportunity once arrived at voting age, and having observed the affairs of the city and us the laws, we proclaim that if we do not please him, he can take his possessions and go wherever he pleases. That's interesting. If you've ever heard this argument, if you don't like it, you can leave it. Well, this is a very early version of that. And so there's this fourth reason being tossed into the mix. So not only did the state provide him with all these services, but Socrates proceeded to accept further benefits for his entire life by staying in Athens. And he could have left, but he chose not to. And if you're saying he wasn't able to consent to 1, 2, or 3, well, didn't he consent to number 4? Like, he's an old man. He's like 70. Surely a 70-year-old can consent. And so their argument is, hey, listen, man, you didn't have to stay here. You knew what our laws were. You knew what you were doing when you went around striking up these conversations. And even if, in an absolute sense, they're not bad, you knew that you were upsetting people. You knew that this could happen, right? You went to a trial. You agreed to be part of it. We didn't just spring this upon you. We gave you a shot in court to defend yourself, and a democratic jury, like hundreds of people, right? It's not even like a jury of 12 or whatever it is with us. It's like hundreds of ordinary people go into a courtroom, watch the trial, and then vote on whether or not the person should be found guilty or innocent. And the majority of them voted that Socrates was guilty. So it seems like he had a fair shot. And aren't you accepting the possibility that something like this might happen if you remain in the state and accept their benefits? Now, there's another critique you might have. And the one critique might go something like this. It's not easy to just pack up and leave, right? The exit costs are too high. Like, yeah, you could say, I could freely get up and leave and go somewhere else, but there's a couple issues here. It's like, what if I don't have the money to do that? Because if I don't have the money, it seems like you're telling me I'm not allowed to dissent unless I have the money to be able to leave. That's one thing you could say. And even if you do have the money, you could say, listen, there's too much of a, not like a monetary cost, but like a cost in terms of social capital. Like, I built my life here. Right? This is where all my meaning is. This is where all my family and friends are. It's not easy to just uproot myself and go away from all of that. And thirdly, maybe you want to say, but what about immigration restrictions at other places? Of course, things were different, but there still could be something like that exists. And then there's also the issue, something that Michael Humer is going to talk about in a few weeks, that when you do that, aren't you just then entering into another state? And what if you don't like their laws? So there are a bunch of different ways at looking at this fourth reason, and it can be perfectly valid because it seems like it constitutes a form of consent. However, there are these other arguments that you might want to consider. And I'm not saying they're good or bad, but they are things you might want to consider. That's for you guys to decide. So I broke down Socrates' argument into this systematic form to show you that, yes, there is a systematic argument there. So you know that an argument is a set of premises that support a conclusion. So from left to right, you have his main argument. And then the orange boxes are the arguments for the second premise. So they're like the sub-arguments. And then the pink boxes are the reasons given in support of the third premise of the orange sub-argument, which is itself a sub-argument to the green boxes. So it's like this multi-leveled argument. Let's take a look. The main idea is, okay, premise one should never wrong another. Okay, we understand that. Premise two is to escape his death sentence would be to wrong the Athenian people and the government. So we say, therefore, Socrates should not escape his death sentence. And that works. That's a valid argument. Right? The conclusion necessarily follows from premises 1 and 2. It's a good deduction. But you might say, okay, even though it's valid, I don't know if it's sound. Like, are those premises true? Even if I buy the first premise, what's the argument look like for the second premise? And that's where the orange boxes come in. It's like, what are the reasons that support the idea that escaping the death sentence is tantamount to harm? Well, premise 2.1, he says, well, when one enters into an agreement, she has an obligation to uphold her end of it. To break this obligation would be to wrong the other party involved. Socrates has entered into an agreement with the Athenian people to follow its laws, and so to escape would be to break the laws, therefore would be to harm. So that's a justification for the green box premise too. And then you say, okay, that's a good point, but maybe you want to press it further, because maybe some of you are reading this and saying, yeah, this is a perfectly reasonable argument. But maybe others are reading this and saying, like, whoa, this is crazy. This seems kind of authoritarian. Like, I'm not sure I'm comfortable giving the state this much power. But let's see the argument for that third orange box. It's like, how is it the case that Socrates has entered into an agreement with the Athenian laws? Well, because his parents were married there, because he was born in Athens, because he was educated in Athens, and because he lived in Athens his whole life. So all that proves premise 2.3, and then all the orange boxes prove premise 2, the green box, and that's the support for the argument. So a lot of stuff to think about here, right? We're dealing with justice, but in dealing with justice, we're dealing with law, and we're dealing with where rightful authority comes from and the extent to which obedience is a good thing, right? These are questions about the role of the individual and the state. These are questions about consent. These are really important questions. And so obviously you see why we needed to do the abstract ethical theory in the beginning, because it's through those ethical systems that we're going to be able to evaluate these more particular social political arguments being made, these specific policy arguments. And so at the end of the day, these are the questions that you want to ask. First off, is Socrates right? Would it be immoral for him to escape? Does he have a point? Like, yeah, I guess he did receive all those services. I guess the least he could do is follow the law. And if he is concerned with virtue, that means having integrity, which means holding on to his beliefs not just when they're convenient, but also if it means dying for them, right? And the second question you're going to want to think about is it immoral by definition to break any law because of a social contract? Because remember, the social contract, as we discussed when we did Republic Book 2, is this idea that in this state of nature, we'll call it, which is something that Locke is going to talk about, anyone could do whatever they want. And this is dangerous, scary, inconvenient, annoying. So we all come to an agreement neither to do nor commit injustice. So we give up certain freedoms and gain safety in return, is the idea. Is that an even trade? Is that a legitimate trade? Does that really happen? Because keep in mind, what's happening to Socrates is not just what's happening to Socrates. Like, this reasoning would apply to all of you and me. Like, do you believe that you've given up your freedom to receive the protection of the police force and the military? Do you believe that there are certain rules you have to follow, that you're obligated to follow merely because you participate in ordered society? I don't know. Because your answer to this question has a bunch of repercussions. Like, how many laws do you break usually? I'm sure most of you break the speeding law. Is that okay? Why? Probably some of you break the seatbelt law. Is that okay? Why? I know we talked about theft before. Is that okay? Why? You have to start asking these questions and thinking of these arguments to legitimize your answers. And maybe the concept of civil disobedience comes to mind, right? Like MLK, was he wrong for doing what he was doing? Or is it sometimes appropriate to challenge authority because the agreement was nullified when they did so-and-so? Or because there was never an agreement? Or because even in the face of an agreement, you have to maintain some kind of, how would you say, dedication to what's right, and maybe what's right goes above and beyond the argument. I don't know. But these are questions you guys want to start to think about. And when you're thinking about them, you want to keep those previous ethical theories in mind. How can you justify your answers to these questions? All right, so that's it for now, guys. I'll see you around.